North Carolina has this wealth of talent and diversity locally that while our scene grows every day, the vibe and the feel is that of like a small, close-knit one where people are quick to link you with a colleague or an associate on a project. Oh, you need this? Oh, this person would be perfect for that.
Nothing really feels as good as like playing in North Carolina. When I had this idea of having a radical, queer Muslim punk band, I felt like I was in the right political time and in the right place for that to happen. Because of like the rich history of like music and protest music and political music and the diversity of music in North Carolina, people receive it in ways that feel like so genuine and so familiar. Nothing hits like North Carolina.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel presented by Folk Alliance International as part of the 2022 Living Traditions Conference. My name is Tressa Levasseur. My pronouns are she and her. And by way of a visual description, I am a middle-aged woman wearing raspberry-colored glasses with a short, curly hairstyle and pale pink skin. There is a plant behind me on this side and a door on the other. I serve as the Program and Community Engagement Manager at Folk Alliance International. Before we begin, let's all take a moment together to note that we are joined by folks from around the planet. And as such, we are invited as a group to collectively recognize the importance and complexity and the difficulty of offering land acknowledgements in the context of online gatherings. I myself am joining you from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, colonially known as Hamilton, Ontario, but the traditional and current territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and also the Between the Lakes Treaty of 1793. And so we invite you to not only join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to work towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but to commit to taking personal, meaningful, and measurable action towards healing the legacies of colonization, forced migration, and cultural erasure. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. We are very delighted to present this panel entitled Exploring Black Appalachian Music, the Sepia Tones Project and Beyond. And to begin today, we're doing something unique for a panel presentation at our conference. We will hear a piece of traditional music performed by Sparky and Rhonda Rucker, and Rhonda will also act as today's moderator coming out of that song. So let's all welcome Sparky and Rhonda. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. We're going to start off with some music playing two banjos. I hear that's against the law in some states.
It ought to be.
But the banjo, of course, comes from West Africa. The ancestors, there's a few ancestors of the banjo that were in Africa, and it ended up, the slaves brought the idea for making the banjo to this country. And of course, the rest is history. It ended up really influencing Appalachian culture and is everywhere now. I mean, we see banjos at all the festivals we go to. And so it's really gotten in.
There ought to be a law.
So anyway, we're gonna play banjo.
In the 1890s in West Virginia, equidistant from Bluefield, West Virginia, and Welch, West Virginia, there was a mining camp called Shawnee, named for the native tribe in that area, Shawnee Camp. It was a coal mine. It was one of the early times that black workers were brought into the mines. Now, there was no other settlements near there, and so when your work shift was over, there was not a whole lot you could do. There was no cable TV, no radio to listen to, and quite often they would spend their time in gambling. And there's this fella that had previously gambled away all of his earnings, and he thought to himself, I believe this man is cheating me. And he turned to his friend Webb Gudger. He said, Webb, I'm going to get this man into another game tonight, and I want you to stand over there by that tree with that Winchester of yours. And if I say he's cheating me, I want you to kill him. But then he went to the table and he pulled out a hog leg. Now, I know you don't know what a hog leg is, but it was one of those big long barrel cap and ball Colt 44s that they used during the Civil War. And he laid that hog leg down on the table. He said, 2 things ain't going to happen tonight. He said, what's that? He said, I'm not going to be cheated. And I'm not going to lie to my gun. Well, they went to gambling. Sure enough, that old Thomas Drew's fella started cheating him. He said to the room, he said, what did I say? They said, you said you're not going to be cheated. And what was the second thing? And you're not going to lie to your gun. And back in those days, it was against the law to kill people, not like today. So he grabbed that gun and bang, shot the man cold. Now, because it was against the law back in those days, he had to make his escape. They tell me there was this scuffle that happened on a railroad train where he was handcuffed to the sheriff, and they both fell off the train. And they finally brought him back to Welch for a trial. And they tell me his mama showed up for the hanging. And she was so old they had to give her a rocking chair to sit in so she could watch her son before he entered into eternity. They bought him a new suit, took him down to the river, baptized him in the river, gave him a new milk white Stetson hat. There's a picture of him on a photograph they took that they made into postcards and sent out to everybody. And he's standing there, you can see him holding that milk white Stetson by his leg. And just before they put the noose over his neck, he took off his hat, sailed it out over the crowd. That style. Man's name was John Hardy. Thought he'd make his getaway. Then up jumped the sheriff and grabbed him by the arm. He said, John, come and go with me. Poor boy, John, come and go with me. John there ain't no bail for murdering a man. So they put John Hardy back in jail. Boy, they put John Hardy back in jail. Let's pick. Yes, he did. Dress she wore, it was blue. You know she went down the track and she never did look back. She said, Johnny, I've been true to you, poor boy. Johnny, I've been true to you. He said, I've been to the east and I've been to the west. In this whole world round, you know I've been to the river and I've been baptized. Won't you take me to that hanging ground, oh boy? Take me to that hanging ground. You can't take me to that hanging ground, oh boy. Then you can't take me to that burying ground. John Hardy was a desperate little man, carried 2 guns every day. He shot that man on the West Virginia line. You ought to see John Hardy in the way, poor boy. Y'all seen John Hardy in the way. You ought to see John Hardy in the way, poor boy. You ought to see John Hardy get away. Hey. John Hardy.
It's one of the old black ballads that Sparky did research on quite a few years ago now. Well, our guests today, we have 2 premier experts in Appalachian studies with us, and both of them happen to be co-hosts of the podcast series for the Great Smoky Mountains Association, Sepia Tones, Exploring Black Appalachian Music. The first guest is Dr. William Turner, and he grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky. He's a longtime African-American studies scholar, a retired distinguished professor of Appalachian studies and regional ambassador at Berea College in Kentucky. And Dr. Turner, along with Mr. Edward Cabell, edited the groundbreaking textbook, Blacks in Appalachia, which was published in 1985. And though he's best known for this African-American research, his work has really encompassed all types of marginalized peoples. For example, those in the urban South, Latino communities in the Southwest. And then one other thing, Dr. Turner has a new book out this year called The Harlan Renaissance, Stories of Black Life in Appalachian Coal Towns. Dr. Ted Olson is our other guest, and he's a professor of Appalachian Studies and Bluegrass, Old Time, and Country Music Studies at East Tennessee State University, about 120 miles away from us.
Yeah, just up the road.
Just up the road, right. He's also a cultural historian, an editor, a poet, a photographer, and a musician. He's written and edited a host of books and essays and pieces focused on Appalachian music and folklore, and 2 of his books won the Appalachian Book of the Year Award from the Appalachian Writers Association. And as a music historian, he's produced and curated a number of documentary albums of Appalachian music. He's received independent music awards along with 7 Grammy nominations for that work. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin at the beginning. I'll ask you, Dr. Olson, maybe you can tell us how this whole project, the Sepia Tones podcast, came to be.
Sure. And thank you so much, Rhonda and Sparky, for the wonderful music and just for joining us today and sharing your story. And of course, we'll be sharing our story. Bill and I came together to work on this podcast, Sepia Tones, exploring Black Appalachian music. It grew out of a lot of interest on my part in documenting the musical history of Appalachia. Over the last, 15 years, maybe 20 years, I've been involved with coordinating the release of historical Appalachian recordings in CD or streamed format, not on vinyl yet. I've actually worked on one vinyl project, but be that as it may, I'm trying to get the music to the people. And in the process of doing this work, it's very important that I curate the music. I mean, really the challenge is to curate the music and to set the music into historical context. And of course, as anyone knows all over the world, people will know about the fact that it's unfortunate that Appalachian people have been stereotyped for generations. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about the true history of Appalachia. And there are a lot of notions that Appalachian culture is kind of a singular tradition. A lot of people think that it descends primarily from, say, British influence, when in fact, Appalachian culture comes from multiple influences and they're all equally important. And so in my work as a music historian, I've been trying to tell the full story about Appalachian music. And in releasing these albums and curating them, I find myself having to tell the story in writing and in photographs and other forms of documentation about all the peoples of Appalachia. And so over the years, different projects have required that I introduce new perspectives on Appalachian music and musicians. And so at one point, I did an album of Appalachian balladry. And it seemed as if much of the research and much of the awareness of Appalachian ballad tradition was traceable back to the British Isles. And that is, of course, part of the story. But there's so much more to the story, such as you folks singing this majestic version of John Hardy, one of the blues ballads of the African-American tradition that is so important to, become part of the story. People have heard John Hardy and John Henry and some of the other great blues ballads, but they perhaps don't realize how extensive the blues ballad tradition is. And so leading from that ballads album that came out in 2017, and in the summer of 2020, with the strife across America involving kind of the lack of fair treatment, the lack of representation, true democratic spirit, that people are well aware of some of those news stories that were circulating and got people so upset, quite understandably. I was searching for something I could do during the pandemic lockdown. And I came up with this thought of doing an album that gathered together artists, from their own sheltered situations, maybe people recording material in their home studios, to explore Black Appalachian music in CD form of some sort. I went to the company I've worked with for so many years, the Great Smoky Mountains Association, which is a non-for-profit organization serving the interpretation of Great Smoky Mountain heritage, and in conjunction with the National Park in Tennessee and North Carolina. And the folks there had other ideas about how to tap into this story. So then rather than pursue kind of a curated CD project, we got into a conversation about doing something involving a podcast, which would involve the voices of people speaking the truth of the Black experience in Appalachia. And all along the way, I was in contact with my good friend, Bill Turner, and Bill is, of course, going to join us here shortly to tell his side of the story. But we worked together to launch this podcast called Sepia Tones, exploring Black Appalachian music. And this podcast has done wonderful work already. And it's, we're about halfway through the launch of the different episodes. And it definitely makes it such a rich experience to hear Dr. Turner talk about his experience. And I'm simply here to provide, kind of another perspective on the topic. And mutually, we've been inviting our friends and people we don't know as well, but we want to be part of the mix. We're bringing people together over the virtual dinner table to sit down and have conversation about the importance of acknowledging and celebrating the Black Appalachian music tradition.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Turner, can you pick up from there? What were you aiming to accomplish with the podcast? What types of things are included in it?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a joy for me to be involved too. I would add, in terms of what Ted said, this is not adding, but just how interesting it is for me, given the times that we live in, when there's this controversy going on about what should we teach our children about America's sordid racial past. I live in a state, for example, the Republic of Texas, where, in fact, we're embroiled all the time with people who are railing against this idea of critical race theory, for example. Well, how can you teach about music in America, unless at some point you deal specifically with things that have to do with race in America and how music itself is categorized by race, when we all would like to think that music brings us together regardless of our racial background. So for this to come together through the Great Smoky Mountains Association and all the work that Ted has done and my own background, particularly 36 years ago when I was about half the age I am now, a friend of Sparky Rucker's and myself, and you too, Rhonda and Ted, we all knew Ed Cabell, whom I would consider, I think, without contradiction, to be the kind of father of modern Black Appalachian studies, having done his dissertation at Appalachian State under Dr. Pat Beaver in the early 70s, where Ed collected a lot of information, of course. We put it together as a book in 1985, but one of the things we did not cover at all in there was Black music in Appalachia in that book we did called Blacks in Appalachia. That was not only an egregious omission, but we just didn't have that much to put down. Well, here we are 35 years later, and no longer can anybody say anything about the invisibility of Black Appalachians from any spectrum of human endeavor, be it music, education, business, military, government, you name it. So I'm just very happy that what we've been able to do so far is show that these Black musicians in the Appalachian canon, just as here in Texas, we see a lot of things coming about now about the people learning more about Black cowboys. And so we're seeing all of this come together here in the first part of the 21st century. And it's really very exciting, because it just underscores another interesting part of America's rich story, and which makes America what it is, and all of this thing that we call diversity. And that's what Sepia Tone tries to do.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, Sparky and I, as we mentioned earlier, we're in East Tennessee, and I know one of the things, Dr. Olson, that I discovered when we were doing research for our Mountains Above and Valleys Below album is that for some of these songs, the cultures have blended together so well that it's sometimes difficult to tease apart the origins. Yeah. And in Southern Appalachia, you've got, the Native American influence. You've got, of course, the African Americans that were brought over here as slaves. And then you've got the Scott Irish and who settled in the mountains. And all of these people came together to form a culture that I personally think is one of the most beautiful and one of the most unique in the world. And I just wondered if you could, Dr. Olson, if you could talk about that a little bit, the different cultures coming together, the blending, especially in light of the projects you've done.
Sure. Several years ago, I guess 20 years ago now, I was involved with the Encyclopedia of Appalachia project. And of course, you folks participated in that, and I'm so glad you did. And basically, I was asked to compile a section of that encyclopedia dedicated to studying Appalachian music, was the way it was placed to me. Well, it didn't take long for me to realize that really that's incorrect, that we need to talk about the region's musical traditions as Appalachian musics, plural. Because as it came time to assign the writing of articles to friends and fellow scholars and other folks who volunteered for this collaborative project, the Encyclopedia of Appalachia, it was so clear that we had a multiplicity of stories. We had nearly 200 separate entries to go into the Appalachian music section. And so I started to think that the way to look at Appalachian music is definitely in the plural, musics. And in that section of the Encyclopedia of Appalachia, we covered every imaginable musical tradition of different groups, different ethnicities, different periods in history, artists of all backgrounds. And so I think what emerged from all that work was that it is truly a blended musical culture. And that's the glory of Appalachian music, is that it's the power of the music. It does draw from different musical traditions that individually are quite rich, but bring them together. And it's one of the world's most famous regional music traditions, perhaps. Many people
greater than the whole.
Yeah, many people talk about Appalachian music as Appalachia's great cultural export. More so than distilled products and things like that. Music is known the world round from Appalachia. Some of the Appalachian artists, some of the Appalachian repertoire. The thing is, though, I mentioned earlier stereotypes. We have to unlayer the cultural stories to make sure that we can get closer to the music and the real stories behind the music, and give the credit where credit is due to the people who are often ignored, who deserve more credit for having introduced, parts of the story or strains of the song, as it were.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Dr. Turner, you grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is in eastern Kentucky and in the coal mining region. In fact, there's a history in Harlan County of a lot of the coal mining struggles there. What kind of music were you exposed to there, as you were growing up? Could you talk a little bit about that?
I grew up, as you said, in Harlan County in a town called Lynch. The name of our town was Lynch. And incidentally, I used to have to disabuse people who say, Lynch, you mean you're from? And I would say, well, the president of United States Steel, which at that time, in 1917, when they bought this property in eastern Kentucky, the president of U.S. Steel was a man named Lynch. That was his last name. So he named the town after himself. My mother was born in that region in 1924. My father had been born there in 1917. My grandmother on dad's side in 1896. Her mother in 1856. So we knew about this in our DNA, even though I used to hear people all the time say to me when I went to college in Lexington, Kentucky at the university in the mid-60s, people would say, "You're from where?" Because there was always this wrinkled brow I would see and this scrunch in people's face trying to say, there are no Black people in that part of Appalachia. And of course, my response, having grown up in Harlan County, going back to this rich mixture of music that came from there, there was also this rich mix of people. In my little town in Harlan County, there were 12,500 people there when I was born in 1946, 38 different nationalities. So I would hear all kinds of people playing up by the big store and the music coming out of people's houses that was from Poland and Yugoslavia and Italy, and the Catholic Church with all the Eastern Europeans, and then the Black Church that was run by Smokies, by Sparky's granddaddy, which was kind of like a old time Pentecostal with Miss Willie Mae singing Jesus is the way, you know. So I heard all kinds of music, but as for popular music, we would basically have country and Western music, as they called it back then. And it came from a local station. I can still remember the call letters, WCPM. I never knew what that meant. But the one where we really got the music of the Black South, including gospel, was WLAC, that 50,000 watt clear channel that went all over the South, selling everything from B.B. King's music to Little Baby Chickens at Easter time and Royal Crown hairdressing, baby. They sold everything. Big John Howling, somebody that would come on there from Gallatin, Tennessee every night. It was almost like Sirius Radio in 1955 when I was 10. So it was almost like we exported Black music from the South, as it were, out of Nashville. But locally, we heard Tennessee Ernie Ford, we heard Johnny Cash, we heard also Which Side Are You On? So we got music from the labor movement because our fathers were involved in the bloody Harlan days of the late 1930s, which is when my father came to Harlan County. My father had worked before that in a coal mine in Matewan, West Virginia. Dad had also worked in Grundy, Virginia. So that's part of what I think we do, even with the music, and especially in the collaboration Ted and I have, is knowing some of the details of the Black presence and where they came from into Appalachia, because by and large, Appalachia did not have a critical mass of Black people, as you might compare to what we call the Cotton Belt Black South of Alabama, Norfolk and South Carolina, some parts of Tennessee, and certainly into Mississippi. But when they came into the mountains, they came in great numbers in West Virginia, particularly in southern West Virginia, a place like Keystone and Welch and Man and War and Beckley and Bluefield. There were just lots and lots of, in fact, not the critical mass, but some of the most important Black political voices, not just music, had come out of West Virginia. Booker T. Washington, for example, came out of West Virginia, in the late 1890s. Carter G. Woodson, who literally gave the impetus to the Harlem Renaissance with his work. So we're very keen in my new book, for example. My book is called The Harlan Renaissance, and I kind of play on this Harlem in New York and Harlan in Kentucky. And the metaphor is to say that New York is where all of these millions of Black people migrated up the East Coast from the Carolinas, from Florida, from Georgia, from, going up Interstate 95, we would call it now, ending up in Harlem and in Boston and in Philadelphia and, of course, New York City. Similarly, people came out of central Alabama, particularly in and around Birmingham, which is where U.S. Steel also had its big holdings, and they came through the Cumberland Gap. They came through Scottsboro, Alabama. Everybody remembers the Scottsboro boys. And they came into Chattanooga, and they came over into the Cumberland Gap and into Hazard, into Jenkins, into Harlan, into Lynch, into Bell County and Perry County, on over into West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Big Stone Gap, Coburn, Norton, Pennington Gap, Appalachia, the only town in the region, Appalachia, Virginia. And I grew up 10 miles from Appalachia, Virginia, in Kentucky, and my father grew up 10 miles from Appalachia in a place called Coburn, which is in Wise County, Virginia. I can remember, Sparky, many years ago, probably 35 years ago, you sang at the it was a youth camp. What was it, like a CC, not a CCC camp, Job Corps camp, Sparky, you remember, out there in Duffield or somewhere like that in Virginia, many, many years ago. So we're glad to be able to disabuse people this idea that there are no Blacks there, but instead to be able to show not only are there Blacks there, but Black people have been there as long as there has been there. So that's, and I think that's what people all over the globe have to realize. If you're in Norway, if you're in the Netherlands, if you're in Venezuela, if you're in Cuba, or wherever, the same as if you'll just look at Appalachia, you will see it's just like the rest of the world. People have been moving in and out of it for centuries now, and it's never been that place. And we're so glad to give these people their due, which they so richly deserve.
Amen.
I know you used to see how many Black people were in Appalachia?
Over 1 million.
Yeah. So
that's a culture.
I wonder that's a culture, but there's probably more now.
More now, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's that many Black people just between Birmingham and Pittsburgh.
Yeah, you've been saying that a long time.
You get a certain age and
right.
drawing those same words, and times change.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Olson, over the past 30 years or so, I've noticed some pretty exciting changes in Black Appalachian music and some new directions, some new voices. And I was wondering if you could comment on any that you would like to highlight.
Well, sure. And there are so many that if I highlight some, I neglect to mention others. I think that it's quite fair, though, that I acknowledge that one of our star students at East Tennessee State University is now an international star in the Americana movement, Amethyst Kia. I remember Amethyst in my American folk music class about maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And she was just had moved from Chattanooga to Johnson City, where East Tennessee State University is located. And I can't speak for her, but she did tell the press shortly thereafter that she enjoyed getting introduced to folk music traditions, partly through the class that she took, that I was a happy, proud teacher of. And so Amethyst Kia is certainly a name people will know about. And there certainly are other people that I would love to give credit to. It's probably a longer list than we have time for, but I will say that I've enjoyed on Sepia Tones talking with folks like Dom Flemons, who's from Arizona originally, but has taken it upon himself to kind of address Black American traditions. And he became vitally interested in our podcast and shared, an hour and a half of his time talking to us on a future episode of Sepia Tones. And so there's two names that I'll mention, and there's certainly many others. And I know that Dr. Turner and I are still looking to close out Sepia Tones, the podcast, with inviting some of these other voices of Appalachia. And so we would welcome to hear from people. We certainly would like to acknowledge what you just said, Rhonda, is that the traditions are being recognized now more than ever. But that leads me right back to thanking Sparky and Rhonda Rucker for keeping the flame alive through all the years. And the very first episode of Sepia Tones, Sparky was our special guest. And folks can listen to that on the platform, on the web. They can listen to Sparky's particular episode of Sepia Tones. And Sparky, you did something that was uncanny and beautiful. You recited a list of the Black Appalachian musicians that you have known personally over the years. And it was so incredibly moving. And some of those folks I knew, and many of those are legendary. I did not know them, but I've known about them. And the very fact of memory, keeping these people alive and sharing stories about them. And of course, one thing I like to do is share their recordings through releases and that sort of thing. We're in it together to try to keep their stories and their music alive. But I did want to thank you, Sparky, and thank you, Rhonda, for keeping the stories and the music alive through so many years, so that people such as Amethyst Kia and Dom Flemons and others today can kind of carry it forward. And of course, other people that are just picking up the banjo for the first time, maybe. They're the future of the musical traditions. And, happily, I think Sepia Tones is adding just a little bit to that, to that effort to celebrate the traditions and to communicate the information and the stories, because it clearly is a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention very quickly too, Ted, in terms of that contact we had with the recently opened National African American Music Museum in Nashville. You recall we had conversations with them about making certain that Black Appalachian musicians are archived, if you will, in that museum, along with rock and roll or all the other various genres of music. And they've been doing a good job with that. They're in Nashville.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Turner, we're running out of time here, but I do want to ask you, what kind of message do you hope that people get out of not only this podcast, but also your life's work?
Well, several things. One, and I think these are just fundamental in any ethnographic work, and that is, where did the people come from? What did they do while they were there, so to speak? And this is trying to put this whole music thing and the general cultural thing of Black Appalachians in perspective. So that what did they do when they got in the mountains? What was done to them, by whom? Specific references to places and people and milestones. And then what kind of global economic forces began to take place that caused the transformation, and particularly the out-migration of people from Appalachia, for example, to go to the other promised lands of Cleveland and Detroit and Dayton and Indianapolis and Columbus and Milwaukee and Los Angeles and all those places where my people went to, for example, after the Second World War. And then we certainly want to look at, well, what's going on with what will people know about when they look at this? What are those people doing in those places now? What's going on besides the horrible opioid crisis in parts of the Appalachian South? What's happening with the music? I note, for example, when I was coming along, or people like Sparky at Austin High School, I'm sure you had these young Black people who were in the band. They played all kinds of instruments, and they got off to the side and they formed them a little rock and roll group called the Jivadeers, or some, they had little 6 and 7 piece bands. Well, now all a lot of kids do is play Spotify. They do not play instruments, they play phones. And so you don't see as many young Black musicians, coming out of the mountains as you used to hear about a guy we knew who ended up playing drums for James Brown and the Famous Flames for 40 years. And he grew up in our home county. So it wasn't uncommon when you would hear people going on into these places where they left and went to in the 60s, and they formed musical bands in those places to which they migrated. So we're looking now about, what about our kids who are there? I have cousins who are 4 generations removed from our grandparents, and they still live in Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky. And I visit them often, and we're trying to work with a group called Black Appalachian Youth Rising that works in conjunction with some people at the Highlander Center to say, look, kids, moving to Detroit might not be such a good idea nowadays. There's no more to do in Detroit than there is to do in Big Stone Gap. So what can you do to stay in Kingsport and in the Bottom and in Mechanicsville and in Knoxville and in Maryville? What can we do to keep these people home, to say Appalachia is your home, you stay there, and we will do what we can to help you build businesses, expand your talents, because all of America's Appalachia all of a sudden. There's only 1 or 2 big companies, just like the 1 or 2 big companies that dominated everything when I was a kid. So it's the same now. And we just hope that these people will see their futures in the mountains of the South.
Well, thank you. And I think we're running out of time, but thank you, both for being on this program, but also especially thank you both for your work, the work that you do. Really appreciate it. Yeah. We're going to close out with a song. This is actually a song that Sparky, back in the early night, I guess around 1981, released an album on the Green Linnet label, an LP, back in the LP days, called Heroes in Hard Times. And it was a collection of Black Appalachian or Black ballads. And it was the culmination, really, of many years of research. And it was a groundbreaking piece, if I may say so myself, a really, a good contribution, I think.
And it happened before we met, so it's
it
not
happened
like,
before we met, and it was one of my favorites even before then. But it's really a good one. And this song starts that album off, and you play it, it's John Henry. You play it a little bit differently from most people when you hear it in the mountains. Where did you learn to play this song?
Well, going as a musician to some of these festivals in Kentucky and West Virginia, and at that time being the only Black performer there, and then all of a sudden hearing a sound off in the distance, and I went, that's somebody playing slide guitar. And I went rushing to that other stage, and it was John Jackson, who himself was not an Appalachian, but he performed at quite a lot of Appalachian venues, and he and I became great friends.
He was doing it bottleneck style,
right, with the handle of a butter knife. I said, now that man's got some mojo. I've got the slide made in Japan. We're trying to include everything. There's a wonderful story about.
Go ahead.
The true story about John Henry. I'm not going to tell that whole story. We'd be here forever. But needless to say, he was brought from the penitentiary in Richmond, Virginia, as a chain gang member to work at the Lewis mine tunnel, which was the tunnel just before they built the Big Bend tunnel. And there was actually a steam drill contest. They were working because it was silica. When the steam drill was drilling through into the tunnel, it was causing the air to be bad. And the paid workers said, "We're not going to work here. It's bad air." But when they brought the chain gang people up, they couldn't say, "No, I won't work here." And obviously, he had impressed a lot of people. He died there at the Lewis Tunnel, and they shipped him back along with other workers who had died, shipped them back to the prison to be buried right next to a huge white building that they call the White House, and it was in a mass grave. And this is some of Scott Reynolds Nelson's wonderful research that I've actually tried to jump in on and learn more things from it, but we'll do you a little piece of it. When John Henry was a baby, sitting on his mama's knee, that Big Bend tunnel on that sea and old road, Lord, is bound to be the death of poor me, Lord. Said it's bound to be the death of poor me. You sing that part with me. Bound to be the death of poor me, Lord. Said it's bound to be the death of poor me. John Henry gonna bring that old steam drill around. Gonna bring old steam drill out on the job. Gonna whop that old steel right on down, Lord, Lord. It's gonna whop that old steel right on. Well, John Henry hammered on the right, steam drill on the left. For I let that steam drill beat me down, I'm gonna hammer my fool self to death, Lord, Lord. I'm gonna hammer my fool self to death. Well, John Henry stepped out on the mountain, looked out on the other side. Now the only word that poor boy did speak, I want a cool drink of water before I die, Lord, Lord. I want a cool drink of water before I die. One more verse. Well, they carried John Henry to the White House, and they buried him under the sand. Now every locomotive that goes steaming right on by, say yonder lies a steel driving man, Lord, Lord. Hey, yonder lies a steel driving man. John Henry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sparky and Rhonda, for playing us out. And Rhonda, great job moderating. A huge thank you to you for guiding this conversation. Thank you also to Dr. Turner and Dr. Olson for sharing your knowledge and your insight, and Sparky for sharing your stories. This was a wonderful hour spent, and this session, luckily for everyone, will continue to be available as a recording on the conference platform all week. Please take a moment to provide feedback in the chat about today's conversation and share it with your friends so they can come and watch it too if they missed it. Finally, our online programming is supported in great part by the generosity of donors, and if you would like to support our work, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. In the meantime, stay safe, stay connected, and in the words of Vivek Shreya, stay kind. We'll see you all soon, community. Goodbye.
Thank you.